Hello again, class. Today we're going to start a series of lectures on the legislative branch. All right. The branch created by Article 1 of the Constitution, the very first one, the branch the Constitution spends by far the most time on. All right. And you see my little subheading there for the legislative branch, making laws and spending money. And although some of you may think I put that last part in, the spending money, as some sort of criticism or joke at Congress's expense, I really didn't. That is quite literally their job duty in the Constitution. The main role of any legislative branch is to make the laws, of course, to write the laws. But if you go through the powers that the Constitution gives to the legislative branch, many of them are focused on finances, all right? Levying taxes, coining money, regulating interstate commerce, appropriating or spending money. Okay, so in social studies or in government, there's some phrases that talk about how power is divided. And generally speaking, a government or a governmental agency in this case, has two types of power. You either have the power of the sword, which the legislative branch does not have, it doesn't control the military, or you have what's called the power of the purse, i.e. you control the money. And Congress is the branch of government that controls the money for the U.S. So that's why I say that the legislative branch is about making laws and deciding how the country spends its money. So in this first lecture, we're going to talk just about some generalities, the basic structure, the positions, and how Congress is set up. So I've already used that word Congress 2 or 3 times. In case you don't know, Congress refers to the federal government's legislative branch. Okay, we call the lawmakers in Washington, D.C. Congress. You see the sort of the background of my PowerPoint here is the Congressional Capitol building in Washington, D.C. All right, so the U.S. Congress is, quote, bicameral, meaning that it has 2 houses. All right, and if you think back to your 8th grade history class, you may remember this is due to the Great Compromise, where we had to make sure the big states were happy and the small states are happy by having one house be equal for all the states. That's the Senate. Every state gets 2 senators, no matter the size. But yet another house, the House of Representatives, had to be based on population. That way the bigger states would get more power in that House of Congress. Right. That was the Great Compromise that allowed the Constitution to be written. So Congress to this day is still a bicameral Congress or bicameral legislature that has 2 houses. The 2 houses include, like I just said, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And the new congressional, quote, session begins every January 3rd of odd number years. Okay. In other words, or not in other words, but how it's structured is, you have a congressional election in the first Tuesday in November of even number years, i.e., November of 2020. We had an election. That election decides who ends up in Congress, which people win the elections, they go to Congress, and they take their seats in Congress on the following January 3rd. Okay? So for instance, what is the 117th Congress or congressional session began on January 3rd, 2021. Okay? So if you multiply that by 2, that's basically 234 years of Congresses. Okay? So again, every January of odd number years, so 2021, in 2023, a new Congress will take its seat. In 2025, and so on and so on. All right, so let's talk about what it takes to get to Congress. There are not that many requirements. You have to be 25 for the House of Representatives. You have to be 25 years old. You have to be a citizen of the USA for at least 7 years, and you have to be a resident of the state that you represent. Right, so you can't live in Texas and run for, Congress in Oklahoma, for instance. Representatives serve for 2-year terms. So that's why you have a new congressional session every 2 years, because every 2 years there's going to be new congresspersons joining. So you start a new session. And as I briefly mentioned, states are apportioned representatives based on population, as determined every 10 years by the census. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two. And currently, most members make about $174,000 a year, but the Speaker of the House, and we'll talk about these positions here in a minute, the Speaker of the House makes about $223,000 or $224,000, and the majority and minority leaders make about $193,000. All right, so let's compare this to the Senate. A lot of similarities, but slight differences. So the requirements for the Senate, you have to be a little bit older. You have to be 30 years old. You have to be a citizen of the USA for at least 9 years. And again, a senator has to be a resident of the state they represent. Right, so you can't live in Texas and be the senator of Oklahoma, for example. No, the senator from Oklahoma. So you can see, because it's a little more difficult requirements for the Senate, you can sort of see the thinking of the people who wrote the Constitution. Right? The senator, they required you to be a citizen for longer, be a little bit older. Also, senators serve for 6-year terms. So you can kind of get the feeling that the drafters of the Constitution definitely kind of considered the senators to be a little more prestigious. That's why they required them to be a little bit older, but they give them longer terms. Now, as you should know, states are apportioned 2 senators each, regardless of population. So Texas gets 2 senators, California gets 2 senators, but so do Rhode Island and Delaware. They each get 2 senators. Most members of the Senate also make $174,000 a year, but the Senate President pro tempore and the majority and minority leaders, they make that $193,000 range. Again, we'll talk about these leadership positions here in just a second. Okay. So as I've already said, congressional elections take place every 2 years. All right, so every 2 years, just like November of 2020, all 435 House members and 1/3 of the senators will be up for re-election. All right, so that means now 1/3 of the senators, 1/3 of 100 is basically 33 and a fraction. So basically every election you're either going to have 33 or 34 senators up for re-election, plus all 435 House members. All right, so that means you could potentially is a key word here, or at least probably theoretically is a better word. Theoretically, you could have, roughly 470 new members of Congress every 2 years if the population and the voters wanted that. But as we're going to find out, the voters do not want that, because incumbents, those are people already holding elected office. That's a very important word for you to know and understand. You'll hear that a lot if you ever read any news or watch the news about elections. They'll talk about the incumbents a lot. So it's a very important word as you get older to make sure you understand. Incumbents are people who already are holding elected office, almost always win. All right, so typically, and I went back and looked at some charts over the last 20, 30 years or so when I came up with these numbers. House incumbents usually win between 90 to 95% of the time. There may have been 1 or 2 elections over the last few decades where it was 88%, but there may be some where it was 96, 97%. All right, so generally speaking, you can assume, a House member, or let me change the way I say that. You can assume every election that about 90 to 95% of those House members are going to be reelected. Now, obviously, you're going to have some that are going to retire. And so it won't be the whole 435 that are running for re-election, but it's usually a lot. Maybe 400 out of the 435 will run for re-election. I think that's about what it was in this past November election. And usually about 90, 95% get re-elected. And if I know, or if I'm correct on my numbers, I'm pretty sure that was the percentage this year. You had 400 House members run for re-election, and I think it was like at 95, could have even been 96% of them got re-elected. Okay. Now that's still 15, 20 of them that didn't, so, that's a fair number that did lose their jobs, but most get reelected. Senators, it's slightly lower, just because you run every 6 years, and so that's, there's more time for the voting environment to change than every 2 years. Plus, House members are given some advantages that Senate members aren't, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. But still, senators, it's still 89%. That's still a pretty good chance of you getting reelected. And there's certainly over history, there's been some examples of people being elected to the Senate, for 30, 40 years in a row, and that they get elected, and that basically becomes their full-time job. Joe Biden's a pretty good example of that. He got elected to the Senate. I think he took his first Senate basically when he was 30 years old, and he continued getting reelected in the Senate until he became President Obama's vice president. And so that's, Joe Biden's a perfect example. He probably spent 30 years in the Senate, but there are other ones. I believe the longest serving one is a guy named Robert Byrd. He may have been in the Senate for a good 50 years. Strom Thurmond was there a long time. There are some others, but it can be pretty much a lifetime job if you can keep getting reelected. All right, so the question is, why? Why do incumbents keep getting reelected so easily? Because after all, what the founders envisioned is, hey, we'll put this government in place, but they have to answer to the people every 2 years. And if they're not doing a good job, then they can be replaced every 2 years. That was the theory. And you have this very odd dichotomy. If you ask most people if they're happy with how Congress is doing their job, most people will say no. But yet, when elections come around, almost everyone goes and votes for the exact same person they voted for in the previous election, even though they don't think Congress as a whole is doing a very good job. So why is that? Part of it is people tend to think, well, the person I voted for is doing a good job. It's the other 434, or if you combine the senators, 535 people I didn't vote for that are doing a bad job. That's part of it, but there are other reasons. So one, incumbents have natural advantages. They have better name recognition and easier access to money. Could argue the second part of that is probably the most important. Once you've already proven you can win an election, people and companies and donors are more likely to give you money because you've already proven that you can win. Someone who's never won an election before, people are going to be hesitant to give them much money because if they lose, then it just feels like a waste of money. But once you win an election, companies and donors are more likely to give you more money because one, you've already proven you can win, and two, you're already in a position to help make a difference. Okay. And the better name recognition. The fact is, most voters are busy. They have lives and families and friends and jobs, and they can't keep track of what, all the congresspersons are doing and every vote that their congressperson takes over 2 years. And so they may not know a lot of the differences between the people running for office. But if every 2 years they keep seeing the same yard sign and the same name on those yard signs, and they keep hearing this name on the news pretty regularly, then you go into the voting booth and you see the name on the ballot and say, oh wait, I've heard of that person before. People have a lot of yards and they must be doing a good job, and so they just click the name just because it's the one they've heard of. So they assume that means the person must be doing a good job. That's one reason. Another reason is the voting preferences of states and district voters just don't change much during a 2-year period. All right. Texas, so if you're talking about, senators, we voted for a Senate position in 2018 that was Beto O'Rourke versus Ted Cruz, and the Republican won. Well, in 2020, there's another senator election. All right. MJ Hager versus versus John Cornyn. Okay, in both times the Republicans won. That's because the total number of Republicans in Texas between 2018 and 2020 didn't change that much. There were more Republicans in Texas in 2018, and there were still more Republicans in 2020. Right? So they're going to keep voting Republican, and it's the same thing is true of House members. Okay, now House members represent, like there's 36 in Texas, so you can see this map. Those are all the House districts, and they're about divided up into very small, sometimes regions. All right, like if you get in Dallas and Houston, House members are representing, just several neighborhoods, not even the whole city. And the people living in those neighborhoods or districts don't change their party affiliation all that much. So if a district was, overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat 2 years ago, well, then this year it's still probably going to be either overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat. It's not going to change that much. Okay. And part of that is because of gerrymandering. This is when seats are drawn to favor one particular party, and these make races uncompetitive. And we're going to have an entire lesson here later in the semester based on gerrymandering, so I'm not going to go into it a lot right now. But just know it's drawing the district's seats in a way that favors one party over another. And what happens is it makes races competitive. A lot of these House races, where you have 435 districts, a lot of them aren't even close. All right? The nominee for one party will get 70, 80% of the vote. In more than a few districts, one party won't even bother to run. All right, so you may have an election where a Democrat's running and the Republicans know, okay, that's a Democratic district. We're not even going to waste the time or money to field a Republican candidate. And the reverse is true too. You have some areas where there's a Republican running and they're so guaranteed of success that the Democrats won't even bother funding an opponent. So you get that. And now there's this gerrymandering issue, which is why you probably have a slightly higher risk as a senator to lose your seat. Well, one, you're there for 6 years, so you can have more changes in what the voters want over a 6-year period. So they can change their mind over 6 years. Senators tend to be higher profile, so if you're doing things that makes people mad, they might tend to remember that more for a senator. And also, you can't gerrymander a state. The state borders of Texas aren't changing. All right, and so you can't change the boundaries of a state to bring in a few more Republican voters or bring in a few more Democratic voters or whatever it is you're trying to do. You can do that for congressional, House district seats, but you can't do that for the state. The state's borders don't change. So that's probably why, a senator is, a little more likely to lose a reelection bid than a House member. Although, again, they're still winning 80, 90% of the time. I wouldn't feel too sorry for them. Now, the one wild card, the one wild card in all this, and it's about to happen now, depending on when you're listening to this lecture, is redistricting. The House of Representatives is based on population. The more population a state has, the more House of Representatives members they get. But the population of states change. Okay? And every 10 years, we take a census. And that census tells us the new populations of each of the states. And so whenever the census data comes in, the number of representatives have to be reapportioned. All right. For instance, Texas right now gets 36 congressional seats. All right. Texas elects 36 representatives to Congress. From what I've read, I think almost everyone assumes Texas is going to pick up seats, that Texas's population has grown faster than a lot of other states, and so Texas is going to gain seats. So here in a couple of years, when the next election, Texas may have 37, maybe even 38 new seats. I'm sorry, not a total of 38 new seats, but a total of 38 seats, period. So they may pick up 1 or 2 seats. Okay? I think last time in 2010, I think Texas added like 4. It was a lot. Okay, and so this changes, and so some states will lose districts. And what happens is when you have to add a seat or 2 or take away a seat or 2, you have to redraw the districts. And so that's kind of a wild card. So every 10 years, the districts get slightly redrawn, and so that can kind of change a little bit who has power. But here's the deal. If the state has to redraw the lines, you have to figure out who redraws them. In some states, it's a sort of a joint committee between Democrats and Republicans. Some it's, where they share the power to do that. But in some states, like Texas, whichever party controls the state legislature essentially gets to redraw the map. So whose party do you think they're going to benefit? Or, whose party do you think is going to benefit? All right, so in Texas, here in 2021, there are more Republicans in the state legislature than there are Democrats. So who do you think is going to get the advantage when Texas here, the next year or so, redraws its congressional districts with the 1 or 2 seats they're being added? Okay. So, that's something to keep an eye on here in the next year or 2. Okay, let's go ahead and, let's go ahead and stop here, but let's go ahead and push forward and let's take Senate leadership positions, and then we'll do the committee. So this may be a slightly longer lecture than normal, but I think we can get through these pretty quickly. Okay, so you have 100 members of the Senate, but they're not all really equal. Okay, they all have equal voting rights. Once they vote on a bill, you just count up. Do you have 50 votes or 51 votes? And every vote counts the same. But within the Senate, you have people in positions of leadership. All right, for instance, the highest ranking member of the Senate, and this is probably going to surprise you, is the Vice President of the United States. Okay, yes, that Vice President. All right, so right now, Kamala Harris is technically the leader of the Senate. Okay. However, the Vice President is only allowed to vote when there's a tie. All right, so if they're voting on a bill and it's a 50-50 tie, then the Vice President gets to vote, but that's the only time. So this right now here in 2021, this effectively gives the Democrats control of the Senate because there's 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. And so if there's ever a tie, then Kamala Harris, who's a Democrat, will get to vote. So that basically gives the Democrats a 1-vote advantage in the Senate. And I think most students are surprised to learn that the Vice President is the head of the Senate because, remember, the Vice President runs on the presidential ticket. So it seems like he or she should be a member of the executive branch. And in a way they are, but they're also a member of the legislative branch. And up until basically about 1960, the Vice President would keep their office in Congress. Now, over the last 60 years or so, the Vice President keeps an office at the White House, so they feel much more like a member of the executive branch today than perhaps they did in the past. But yes, the Vice President is technically the leader of the Senate. They don't really do much unless there's a tie, but technically they're there. So the person who basically is the leader of the Senate on a day-to-day basis is this position called Senate President pro tempore. And they're elected to the position by other senators, which basically means they're almost always going to be the same party of whichever political party has the most senators, because they have the most votes to give, and so they basically will select someone in their party to be the Senate President. And their job is to preside over the Senate when the Vice President is absent, which again, especially here in the last 50, 60, 70 years, is almost always. Now you have a majority and minority party leaders. All right, so it's simple. The majority party is just the political party that has the most elected members. All right, so if Republicans up until the most recent election had 52 senators, Democrats had 48, so the Republicans were the majority party and the Democrats were the minority party. Right now, as I said, it's 50-50, but since the Democratic vice president breaks the tie, the Democrats essentially have the majority position. And so the leader that they've voted to be their leader is Senator Chuck Schumer from New York. So the minority leader, who is the majority leader, all right, Mitch McConnell, he was the majority leader up until 2 months ago. He's from Kentucky. They serve as their party spokesperson. So if you ever hear about what's going on in the Senate or what bills are going to be heard in the Senate or what the big debates are, it's a pretty good chance you're going to hear from one of these two people. You certainly can hear from other senators on positions, but these are the two people who you're most likely to hear from on the Senate. And they work to control the Senate's agenda and their schedule, so it's a very, very important position. Because if they don't want an issue to be brought up before the Senate, the majority leader has a lot of power to keep that issue from being heard and just sort of set it aside and hopes it goes away before the next or until after the next election. And then you also have what are called whips, the majority and minority party whips. And a whip is basically, first of all, they sort of serve as the assistant to the majority and minority party leaders. But what they are, they're in charge of coordinating their party's votes and knowing how many votes they have on a certain bill and making sure that the people are there to vote on time and that sort of thing. All right, so political party typically doesn't like to push a bill forward unless they think they have a pretty good chance of winning it. And it's the whip's job to kind of go around, talk to the other party members, say, hey, how do you think you're going to vote on this bill? Do we have enough votes? Should the majority leader call for a vote? Or if we don't have enough votes, maybe we should better table it until we can get some more votes, that sort of thing. That's the whip's job, to basically kind of know how every member of that party within the Senate is going to vote on certain bills, make sure they're coordinated and they're ready to vote at the right time and that sort of thing. All right, the House leadership positions. All right, the leader of the House is called the Speaker of the House. And she's one of the most important positions in the government. All right, and so she right now, it's Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She's from a district in California. She was elected by other members of the House after what we call a caucus. That's a meeting among the majority party. All right, so what happens when the Democrats here in, I believe, 2018 is when they became the majority party again. They all had a meeting, decided who they wanted to be Speaker of the House. They selected Nancy Pelosi. They then basically nominate her, and then the whole House of Representatives votes on her. But again, since the Democrats had more votes, they're going to win that vote, and that's exactly what happened. And then, if in 2 years or 4 years or however many years the Republicans have more members in the House, they'll do the same thing, and they'll pick the Speaker of the House. All right, so right now it's Nancy Pelosi. She presides over the House and serves as its administrative leader. All right, so again, she has a lot of power in determining what bills are heard in what order and that sort of thing. And she's effectively the leader of the majority party. So she's effectively the leader of the Democrats in the House. And another reason, at least in theory, that makes the Speaker of the House a very important position is they are second in line to succeed the president behind the vice president. So I know students always love to ask, well, who? All right, so if something happens to the president, the vice president's in charge. But what if something happens to the vice president? That sort of thing. Well, the Speaker of the House would become president. So now, the Speaker of the House has never become president in our 230 plus years history, but that's how it would work in theory. Okay, and then like in the Senate, the House has a majority and minority leadership, play the similar role as they do in the Senate. The only difference is the quote-unquote majority leader, they're really behind the Speaker of the House in terms of the pecking order. So although there is a position where right now there's a Democrat who's technically called the majority leader, they're really sort of in the number 2 position behind the Speaker of the House. For the Republicans, however, since they don't have the Speaker of the House, their leader is the minority leader, this guy named Kevin McCarthy there. I have a picture of. This at work. And then each party has a whip, just like in Senate, same type job. All right, so the last subject we want to talk about are committees. Because within Congress, committees do most of the day-to-day work. All right. Most people probably have this view of Congress because you have 100 senators and 435 House members, and that all 535 people are sitting in their respective chambers every day just proposing bills and debating them and voting on them. And that's not really what happens. Most of the day-to-day work gets done in committees. And the committees, and as you can see in this picture on the right, I know that's not a great picture. You can't really read that very well. But what that picture is showing you is the type of committees. All right, so committees are based on certain issues, such as the Agriculture Commission or the Energy and Commerce Commission. There's a Judiciary Commission and an Education Commission, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so you have lots of different committees. And you can see from that slide, I know you may not be able to read them very well, those names, but you can at least see how many there are. That blue box is for House of Representatives, red box is for the Senate, and you can see how many different committees, and there are quite a few. And so what do these committees do? Well, they investigate and hold hearings on certain issues relative to the committee. All right, so if there's some issue that the Agriculture Committee, for instance, wants to take up, there's some issue involving agriculture, they may have hearings, and they can call witnesses, they can subpoena witnesses and documents, and try to learn more about a subject so they know if they need to try to propose a new law or not. And that's a big part of how they spend their time. And then probably the most important thing they do is they decide which bills, all right, and if we haven't talked about it before, a bill is a proposed law. So if someone writes down a law and says, I think the law needs to be, don't rob banks on Tuesday, that is a bill. When both houses pass, both the Senate and the House pass it and the President signs it, then it becomes a law. Before that, we refer to it as a bill. Okay, but committees usually get to decide which bills get voted on. All right, because you have 535 members of Congress, they're constantly proposing all these bills. So you have hundreds and hundreds of bills constantly being proposed. Well, it'd be chaos and inefficient if the full Congress had to vote on each of those every time. Okay, and so what happens is they go to committees, and only if a committee supports the bill does it then go on to be voted on by the main, the whole body. And party membership in the committees typically mirrors the percentages of each of the parties in Congress. So, for instance, if one party has 55% of Congress persons and the other party has 45%, then each committee is going to be basically 55-45. Okay, so right now, it's probably more like 52% for the Democrats, 48% for Republicans. So, which means the committee is going to be almost as identical. There'll probably be one more Democrat in each committee. All right, so for instance, if you had 39 members in a committee, you'll have 20 Democrats and 19 Republicans, something like that. Now, 4 years ago you had more Republicans in Congress, so they would each probably get 1 or 2 extra members in the committee. All right, so there are 4 types of committees we're going to talk about. Standing committee, that's a permanent committee. Pretty easy. This list that you probably can't read on the right, those are a list of all the standing committees. Those are permanent committees. They're always there. Have been for years and years. And within each of those standing committees, you have subcommittees. Okay? These are smaller committees within each subcommittee. All right, so like I just said earlier, I gave a hypothetical where you have 39 members of a committee. Well, it's hard for 39 members to really kind of work together all at once. That's a big group. So they'll divide into subcommittees and say, okay, why don't 6 of you go take this task or do this function. All right. So you always have subcommittees. Select committees are temporary committees that are formed for a specific issue. I see there I wrote temporary issue formed for a specific issue. It's supposed to be temporary committee formed for a specific issue. All right. So I don't really have much to add to that other than they're temporary. You can have them sometimes you won't. And then fourth, a conference committee. And a conference committee is made up of members of both the Senate and House. These other committees, they're usually just either, the House will have a committee and then the Senate will have a separate committee. But a conference committee is made up of members of both the House and the Senate. Because what a conference committee does is it meets whenever there's a law, or I'm sorry, not a law, a bill that was passed in both houses, but that is slightly different. Okay? So what happens is when a bill is passed in one house, okay, say it's passed in the House first, and you get 235 say yes, 200 say no, so that bill's passed. Well, it doesn't become a law until both houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, vote yes, and it goes to the President. So you have a bill, passes the House, goes over to the Senate. And the Senate takes it, and they make a couple changes to it, and then they pass the bill as well. So now the question is, well, you have two bills kind of doing the same thing, but you have these two changes. So what happens? So a conference committee are members from each house, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they kind of negotiate and work out a compromise. And then that compromise bill goes back to both the Senate and the House of Representatives. They vote on it again, and then if both of them say yes, then it goes to the President to be signed. All right, so that's what a conference committee does. Very important job, because otherwise you'd almost never be able to get the House and the Senate to agree to the same bill, and things wouldn't get passed. All right, so the last slide we're going to talk about, committee appointments. All right, so party leaders appoint congresspersons to certain committees. All right, and this is a very important role because congresspersons have very strong desires to be on certain committees. The committees they think that will get them the most power or make them look best to their voters. Okay, and so certain committees, typically year in, year out, are often seen as the most coveted or the most desired. The Ways and Means. Now, this is only in the House, but all tax bills, all laws revolving taxes have to start in the House of Representatives, and they have to go through the Ways and Means Committee. So this is a very important committee to be on because you basically get to form the tax policy. All right, so people really want to be on that committee. Brings them lots and lots of exposure. Energy and Commerce, which is what it's called in the House. Energy and Natural Resources is what it's called in the Senate. But basically the Energy Committee, obviously that deals with like oil and gas and very important issues like that. Then Appropriations, which again are in both houses. And that's basically talking about how money is spent. Okay, so again, that gives you lots and lots of power. Because remember, the main job of Congress is to make laws and to spend money. So if you're on the committee that decides how the money's spent, that gives you just about the most power in Congress. So those are very important. And then some members are going to have particular interest in other committees. Some of it may be, it has to do with a committee that's very important to their state. All right, so if they're in a farming state, they may want to be on the Agricultural Committee. Some of the other committees that people may have particular interest in are things like the Judiciary Committee. That's only in the Senate, and they get to approve the president's nominees for judges. All right, so if you have a particular interest in the courts and judges, you'd want to be on the Judiciary Committee because you have a very important role in deciding which judges, including which Supreme Court justices, get appointed. Or perhaps the Armed Services Committee. That's a pretty prestigious committee, because it deals with military matters. All right, I know this lecture was longer than most of them. So we'll go ahead and cut it off here, and then we'll pick up the rest or the next lecture in the next session. And if you're listening to this in March of 2021, it'll be our next class after spring break, so enjoy your break.